Welcome learners to the 6th session in Development Economics course. This session is titled Economic Inequality, Concept and Measurements, and as usual we have Professor Vidhana Pathirana to take us through the lesson. To start with, Professor, what is inequality?
There are two ways to look at inequality. One way to look at inequality is as income inequality, which is about the existence of disproportionate distribution of GDP income among households, whereby the share accrued by the rich people is far more than the share accrued by the poor people. So it's about, in a population, some people get a higher share or lion's share of GDP, and others as a result gets a lesser share. That is income inequality. There's another inequality which is known as economic inequality, which was defined by Amartya Sen. He says economic inequality as a wider notion. He says it's a wider notion affecting inequalities and substantive freedoms. It's a wider notion affecting inequalities and substantial freedoms. This was 2000. Sen said that, therefore, inequality can be of two types: income inequality and economic inequality.
Professor, can you comment on the global inequality situation today?
Yeah, globally, we have been seeing continuously that the inequality also, like in poverty, has been very high in certain parts of the world. Now, we will look at some of the measures of inequality. Without looking at measures of inequality, we can't say in some parts it's high and some parts it's low. But on the whole, inequality is very low in countries that are in Canada and that part of the America, and also countries like the Europe, part of Soviet Union, part of the old Soviet Union, Australia. Those are places where the inequality has been found less. And there are areas where it has been absolutely high, very high inequality has been seen in countries like South Africa and also some of the other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and mostly also in Latin America. We have seen very high incidence of inequality.
Could you tell us about some measurements of measures of inequality?
Yeah, it's very useful to know about the measurements of inequality, but also if you are to give some evidence of inequality, high inequality. South Africa's inequality, this must be 2006 or 7, has been about 0.5%, more than 0.5. I'll tell you more than 0.5 or what later. It's more than 0.5 in comparison with, for instance, a country like Ethiopia, which is a very poor country, but inequality is less, it's 0.3, right? And another country which is medium income country like Brazil, where the inequality level was about 0.57, which is about almost 0.6. So point which is high, if the point value is high, more inequality, point value is low, less inequality. So some countries have more inequality and some countries have less inequality. Now you ask me about the Lorenz curve. Now Lorenz curve was the first measurement or indicator of inequality. And there is a way of drawing the Lorenz curve or computing the Lorenz curve, and there is also a way of interpreting the Lorenz curve. Now, what does it contain? Lorenz curve is a square, a box-like thing, where you have in the vertical axis, you have the cumulative percentage of income, and the horizontal axis, you have the cumulative percentage of population. That is, population in deciles or segments, or population in quintiles or 20% segments or 10% segments, An income in 10% segment, if it is 10% segment, we call it decile. 20% segment, we call it quintile. So you have vertical axis, the income, cumulative income. Horizontal axis, you have the cumulative population. And it plots these cumulative aspects, cumulative value of income and cumulative value of population in those two curves, vertical and horizontal curve. So once it is done, you will get two curves. In fact, the first curve will tell you if the first 20% of population or first 10% of population gets 10% of income share, which means equity. 10% of population gets 10% of income. Second 10% of population gets the second 10% of income. Third 10% get the third 10% of income. Likewise, 50% of population get 50% of income. 70% of population get 27%. So this is we call absolute equality or perfect equality or line of perfect inequality. And the real inequality is plotted against this one, which tells you how far we have been deviating from the perfect inequality. So Lorenz curve plots one, the perfect inequality of income, and the Lorenz curve, which is the actual distribution of income, right? So that is Lorenz curve. And how would you interpret it, right? Interpretation of inequality comes if, for instance, if the Lorenz curve gets closer to the line of perfect equality, if it is closer to that, that is less equality. If you move away from the line of perfect equality, that is high inequality. Moving away from always, moving away from the line of perfect inequality is known as more unequal or unequal distribution of income or maldistribution of income. So that is the interpretation.
Okay. Professor, is there a link between economic growth and inequality?
Yes, in fact, the earlier figures that we quote showed some examples of, Ethiopia, which is a very poor country, which a per capita income of something like US dollars 400, having a low inequality ratio, right? And a rich country, particularly not a very rich country, but medium income country like Brazil, with medium income of something like 5,000, 6,000 US dollars per capita, having an income inequality of 0.5, 0.7, double the Ethiopian level. So, in fact, which shows that there has to be the GDP level and GDP growth and inequality nexus connection. So, this connection tells you that in some countries inequality is low, particularly the poor countries, the inequality is low, and it grows slowly, particularly in the primitive societies, right, where everybody is almost like equal in terms of status, in terms of income. There's less inequality. But high inequality is seen in other countries where you have a structured society. But mind you, if it is a primitive society with low inequality, there's a connection between growth and inequality, because if there's perfectly unequal situation, there's no incentive for people to work hard, because however much you work, you get the same income. How much you work, you get the same status. However much you work, you get the same endowment set. So you have no incentive to work. So there's a growth equity connection. Some connection is there. High inequality is bad. Now that's the first one I said. Inequality must be there. Some kind of inequality should be there. Otherwise, there's no incentive. But when you have a very high inequality, that is bad. Very high inequality is bad because it creates social tensions. it creates political unrest among people. So therefore, very high inequality also is bad. So there is some connection between growth and equity. These connections are, if I may continue, were first seen by a man called Simon Kuznets in 1950, long ago. And in fact, he plotted the income levels and inequality levels of countries across the globe, and his sample included Sri Lanka also. That's the important one, you know. So he showed that his connection between income and or growth and inequality was depicted in a thing called inverted U hypothesis. Inverted U hypothesis, which is the other side, right? Not the U side, but it is like a mountain now. So income inequality low at early stages of growth accordingly, and tends to increase when the income increases at high, and when you have a very high income, again inequality comes down. Again, it's low at low income countries, then when the countries are growing, it grows, and then it comes down when you become very rich. That's what it says. Not necessarily it comes down to the zero level, but it becomes lessened. So that's why it is an inverted U hypothesis. So that's about the connection. You may see Kuznets curve later, and that will tell you what is the relationship between the income growth and inequality.
Okay. Professor, can you explain about the Gini coefficient to us?
Okay. The concept of Gini coefficient is invented by a person called Gini. What he did was, he tried to convert the areas covered in the Lorenz curve into a absolute figure. And that absolute figure, which is not really an absolute figure but a relative figure, he says that figure ranges from 0 to 1, from 0 to absolute 1. So, which necessarily means that to have value, it can be 0.001 to 0.9999, right? It's point. So that's what I said, that in Ethiopia the ratio is 0.3. That's Gini ratio. And for another country like we said South Africa, it's 0.4, which is higher than that, right? Which is a country which is a higher inequality, but also higher income, South Africa. And we said Brazil, it is still higher, again a rich country, not really very rich country, but a growing country, medium income country, which has a 0.57 inequality. And that 0.57 is a Gini ratio, right? So Gini ratio, what it does is, it summarizes the graphical presentation of Lorenz curve into an arithmetic value that range between 0.0 and 0.001 to 0.999.
Okay, and what does Sri Lankan data say about inequality?
Yeah, now Sri Lankan data on inequality has been showing a few interesting figures. One thing, before going to some of the details of Lorenz curve and Gini ratio, one might wonder that there is a very huge regional divide. For instance, you might wonder that the Western province has a population of less than 30% of people. Strictly speaking, it's about 28% of people live in the Western province. But its income share was in 2005 51%. It has come down. It has come down to 45% or something like that. Still, 30% of population gets 50% of income, and that is Sri Lankan situation in relation to regional divide, regional distribution. In terms of personal distribution, we have seen Sri Lanka inequality has been growing particularly in the 1980s and 1990s and even up to 2000. It has been growing. It was in the range of 0.4 or little more than 0.4 earlier, come down to 0.38 or something like that, which is fairly high rate for all developing countries. And that was, as I said in an earlier discussion, the economic policy of opening the country to free market has created certain incentives, a large quota of incentives to the rich people to earn more, and the poor people lagged behind. So therefore, historically, the inequality in Sri Lanka has been very high. Up to 2000, even 10, there is slight reduction of inequality, but it has been fairly high.
Okay. And what are the evidences that we have for inequalities not directly related to income in Sri Lanka?
Yes, there are aspects like, and when we discussed the poverty also, we said one area is the gender perspective. The structure of employment and income opportunities for females right around the country has not been equitable. Not been equal is far off, but not even equitable. Only sector where females registered a better share of labor force is the tea estates. And that is because in the tea estates, most of the tea plucking is done by women. Otherwise, generally the labor force participation has been it favored male population, and it is worst in the liberalized urban sector. The labor force participation was very highly skewed towards male population in the urban sector. And this has been not a Sri Lankan problem. It's global. It's like that. Until you reach a particular level of equity, like the Scandinavian countries, the situation is going to remain like that. Countries like Bangladesh and India records a much worse situation than Sri Lanka. So one problem is the female participation. If you ask me to give some figures, estates has 2003, 2004, 43% of female participation. Rural sector only 32 participation, urban sector 30 participation. So you'll see the liberalized urban sector has the worst female participation. And not only the participation, wage-wise, also you can see that what is paid to males, not in the organized sector, is not paid to females. It's relatively lesser. If, for instance, if a male worker is paid 500 rupees per day, a female worker doing the same job will be paid, say, 350, 400 rupees. That's particularly in the casual work sector in the country, where you have road building and building construction and various places. The situation is similar. Second non-income area is education. Access to education, if you look at the richest people, the top 20% of population. Net junior secondary grades, the access to education, the top quintile, the ratio is 76%. Secondary grades, 60%. That's top quintile. Tertiary grades, 13% of the population has access to tertiary education. That's university and above. If you look at the bottom 20%, tertiary education access is only 2%, not 13%. And net secondary education, tertiary access is 31%, not 60%, half. If you look at junior, it is little better, 76% for the highest high income group or high top quintile, and the bottom quintile is 61% because of compulsory education up to 14 years or whatever. So still you will see that access to education has not been very good which is non-income, not directly related to income, but education access is another area like gender. So these are some of the aspects. There are details, but these are some of the aspects that we see in terms of non-income related inequity in the population. Of course, there are other areas like, for instance, the access to health. In most developing countries, it was found that women workers usually delay medical treatment, one, because they cannot go alone, second, because they don't have access, third, because they don't have money, fourth, because they have less priority, fifth, because they usually hide their sicknesses. So many reasons makes the women in the population medically more prone to long-term sicknesses because of delaying medical treatment. So these are some of the areas.
And to wrap up this session, Professor, could you just give us a conclusion of the session points?
Yeah. Now, we have seen the patterns and trends of high income inequality worldwide, and Sri Lankan figures have not been very encouraging, but Sri Lanka has been, some of the recent figures show, like the regional inequality has been falling. It covers not only income dimension, as we said just now, it covers many other dimensions. It covers the gender, it covers the regions, it covers the sectors, it covers health, it covers education, it covers employment also. So all these manifestations are known as non-income related aspects of inequality. You have income related inequality aspects which can be measured using Lorenz curve or Gini coefficient, which we have seen that it has been high for middle income countries and fast developing low income countries. It's generally low for very poor countries and generally low again for very rich countries, and that's what we termed as the inverted U curve. So we also found another measure known as Gini ratio, which we try to interpret in terms of high inequality if the value is more than 0.5, 0.6, 0.7. If it is less than 0.3, 0.2, it's low inequality in terms of Gini ratio. We look at that as well. Then we also look at the aspects of markets creating more inequality. We discussed some of the things like, why Western province with 30% of population getting 50% of income, which is because Western is the most, the province that was exposed heavily to the market. It is not so for the other provinces. We also have discussed a little bit, we really did not discuss, but we also stemming from or emanating from the discussion we can look at the need for public action or failure to resurrect public action. Now, public action here does not mean, people going to streets. Public action here means, according to Keynes, funding the education, funding the health sector, funding the nutrition sector, so that people will have capabilities. They will not be deprived of capabilities, as a result of which they will earn more, and that will create more equity. And that is, I think, where we can conclude this session.
Thank you so much, Professor Vidhanapatirana. And that concludes our session 6 of the Development Economics IMM course. Please refer to your textbook for more about the lesson. Thank you very much.